In April of 1844, 2 months before he was killed, Joseph Smith delivered what's now called the King Follett Discourse. In it, he made a specific claim about the Hebrew word bara, the word translated as created in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. He said that it doesn't mean to create from nothing, it means to organize. It means that God organized pre-existing eternal matter, and that intelligence and matter are co-eternal with God, and nothing was made from absolute nothing. He was then working from his own understanding of the Hebrew language in 1844, with no academic framework to back him up, and the established scholarly consensus of his day actively pointing in the other direction. But 134 years later, a German Protestant theologian named Gerhard May published the definitive academic treatment of creation ex nihilo and concluded that the doctrine was in fact a 2nd century invention, not a reading of the Hebrew Bible. And he definitely wasn't trying to vindicate Joseph Smith. He was just following the scholarship. That's just one example. This episode is about the rest of them. Across physics, ancient Near Eastern scholarship, Hebrew Bible studies, and archaeology, modern research keeps landing on conclusions that Joseph Smith reached in the 1800s. Before we get into it, the sources that I'm using today are primarily non-LDS. Today I'm going to walk you through what the scholars actually found, and if your response is that those scholars got it wrong, then you should engage the scholarship directly, because dismissing non-Christian secular academics as biased towards the LDS position isn't a real response. It's just avoiding the question. All of my sources today are in the pinned comment, so go check those out. I also want to be crucially clear that what I'm covering today is not an exhaustive list. I covered some stuff last episode, and there are more scholars, more findings, and more lines of evidence than any single video could ever hold. This is just a representative sample. With that being said, if you're the type of person who wants to show up in the comments to still say that there is zero evidence for the Book of Mormon or for Joseph Smith, you might want to stop here unless you're open to having that reconsidered. Because even if you reject the majority of what I'm about to cover, like even if you dispute the interpretations and even if you walk away still 100% skeptical, zero evidence stopped being an honest description for the Book of Mormon a long time ago. If you're LDS and you want to be better prepared for this conversation, this is another one of those episodes. If you're skeptical or just curious, here's the evidence. Make of it what you will. I'm Alex Arnold, and this is Moroni Standard. So, what's the pattern that I keep pointing to? What is it that keeps getting confirmed? The simplest way to describe it is this. Joseph Smith made specific, verifiable claims about Hebrew language, about ancient cosmology, and about the ancient historical world that the Book of Mormon describes. At the time that he made them, most of them had no academic support, and some of them even contradicted the dominant scholarly position of the day. But then, over the following century and a half, independent scholarship in completely unrelated fields started arriving at conclusions that line up with what he said. What makes this pattern so noteworthy is the litany of non-LDS researchers who found it as well. These include a German Protestant theologian reconstructing the history of a doctrine, a Wisconsin-trained Hebrew scholar working through divine council theology in the Old Testament, a British Methodist scholar reconstructing what the Jerusalem temple originally contained, and groups of non-LDS archaeologists digging in Yemen. None of the scholars were trying to corroborate Joseph Smith, and none of them coordinated with each other. And what's so specific about this is that the picture they're recovering matches what Joseph Smith described, not what 19th century biblical scholarship described. That's the big distinction that matters. When scholars working from the ancient sources find what Joseph was saying rather than what his contemporaries said, that's not a coincidence. That's the pattern. So let's work through it field by field. Let's start with the most fundamental level, matter itself. Joseph said that the elements are eternal. How does that hold up? In Doctrine and Covenants, section 93, verse 33, it explains our position pretty plainly. It says the elements are eternal. The LDS position is that matter is co-eternal with God, that God organized existing material rather than creating it from absolutely nothing. And when you look at where modern physics has landed completely independently, that turns out to be a well-supported position. The first law of thermodynamics says that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only converted from one form to another. That's foundational physics, confirmed by every experiment that we've ever run, not a contested point. Quantum field theory describes the universe as existing within fields that have never not existed. What physicists call the quantum vacuum isn't actually empty. It contains non-zero energy even at its lowest possible state. The Big Bang model describes the expansion of the universe from an extraordinarily hot, dense initial state, but it doesn't say anything about where that initial state came from, and it doesn't describe something emerging from absolute nothing. Physicists are careful to distinguish between those two things. The problem for mainstream Christianity is that ex nihilo creation, God creating everything from nothing, requires energy coming into existence at the moment of creation, which directly contradicts energy conservation. The theological response is that God exists outside the laws of physics, and that is definitely a coherent position. But notice what it concedes. The doctrine can only be maintained by placing God entirely beyond physical investigation, and that creates a tension. Because if God is exempt from the laws of physics when it's convenient, you've made the doctrine unfalsifiable. You can't then claim that your cosmology is scientifically grounded and also say the science doesn't apply. Physics doesn't describe a God, but it does describe a universe that is consistent with organized eternal matter and inconsistent with absolute ex nihilo creation. LDS doctrine fits that physical picture. The ex nihilo doctrine doesn't, and its defenders know it, which is why the special pleading exemption even exists. Joseph Smith said the elements are eternal in 1844, and modern physics has been arriving at the same picture independently for over a century. Now, a natural question here is, where is ex nihilo actually from if it's not from the Hebrew Bible? Well, our guy Gerhard May traced this pretty carefully. The doctrine was developed in the late 2nd century AD specifically to counter Gnosticism. The Gnostics were teaching that matter was inherently evil and that the God of the Old Testament was a lesser, malevolent creator. The Orthodox response from theologians like Irenaeus and Tertullian was to establish that God was the absolute source of everything, including matter. So they constructed and invented ex nihilo, not from the Hebrew text and not from the Greek New Testament, but from the specific needs of a theological argument in the 2nd century. The Hebrew word bara in Genesis 1:1 does not require creation from nothing. The Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew lexicon, the standard academic reference, doesn't define it that way. So, Joseph Smith read the Hebrew correctly in 1844. The academic community documented exactly how and when the institutional tradition departed from the text 134 years later. Once again, they agree with Joseph. So, what about human progression towards God? The Lorenzo Snow couplet. That's one of the doctrines that critics treat as the most obviously invented. LDS doctrine teaches that humans are the literal spirit children of God, with the potential to become what God is. Lorenzo Snow's formulation was, as man now is, God once was. As God now is, man may become. Critics claim this as a New Age mythology, but the more useful question for this topic is what the Hebrew Bible was actually saying before later theological frameworks got layered on top of it. And before we get into what the scholars found, we have to note yet again that Joseph Smith didn't have access to Heiser's research, the Dead Sea Scrolls, or Barker's reconstruction of the First Temple. Those sources either didn't exist yet or they weren't available to him. He was working in 1830. So, when his descriptions of the ancient world turn out to match what scholars recovered a century later from sources that he never saw, that's the argument. Michael Heiser spent his academic career working through what he called divine council theology in the Hebrew text. He held a PhD in Hebrew Bible and Semitic languages from the University of Wisconsin, and he was a Protestant. His conclusion, documented in The Unseen Realm, is that the original Hebrew worldview included a cosmos with multiple divine beings in a hierarchical structure, with humans created in the image of that divine council, and with deification language. Humans progressing toward divine status, genuinely present throughout the text. This is all mainstream scholarship. Psalm 82 has God standing in a divine assembly, telling its members, "You are gods, sons of the Most High." Heiser also works through in detail why the contextual grammatical and ancient Near Eastern comparative evidence points to actual divine beings, not a metaphor for human judges. Jesus quotes that verse in John 10, verse 34, when he's defending his own divine identity, an argument that only works if the verse is actually about genuine divine status. The Dead Sea Scrolls version of Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 8, which is an older manuscript closer to the original version, describes God dividing the nations according to the number of the sons of God, not the sons of Israel, as later manuscripts read, sons of God. The earlier tradition is sitting right there in the text. The Nicene theological framework just filtered it out. The Hebrew still has it. And then there's Margaret Barker, a British Methodist scholar who served as president of the Society for Old Testament Study. She spent decades reconstructing what the First Temple tradition actually contained before Josiah's reforms reshaped it. Deification theology? Present. Divine council structure? Present. Sacred garments associated with transformation? Present. Ascent rituals, humans being elevated into the divine presence? Present. All of it was documented across ancient sources, including the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Merkaba mysticism texts, ancient Israelite inscriptions, and the priestly ritual descriptions in Exodus and Ezekiel. But all of it removed in the institutional religious reform of the 7th century BC. When Barker first encountered LDS temple practice, she recognized it immediately. And in a 2003 paper she came to BYU to deliver, she said, "When I first read about the Mormon temple ceremony, I was astonished. Here, I said to myself, is someone who knows about the first temple." This is another mainstream non-LDS scholar using non-LDS methodology, recognizing LDS temple practice as a preservation of what she'd spent her career finding in the ancient sources. Now, I keep mentioning Josiah's reforms. So what happened there and why does it matter for the Book of Mormon specifically? The documentary hypothesis is the dominant framework in academic Old Testament scholarship for how the Hebrew Bible was actually composed. It's been the consensus for over a century, even though it's kind of getting debated now, but it's what biblical scholars work within professionally. This is all taught at secular universities. What it establishes is that Genesis through 2 Kings shows multiple distinct authorial voices, written at different times with different theological agendas, and then edited together over a long period. The Deuteronomistic history, meaning Deuteronomy through 2 Kings, was composed or heavily edited during King Josiah's reign around 621 BC, roughly 600 years after Moses. Richard Elliott Friedman's Who Wrote the Bible covers this accessibly. If you want to go follow the argument yourself, go read that. The key event is in 2 Kings chapter 22, when Josiah's high priest just finds a book of the law in the temple. Now, found is a word that scholars have had air quotes around for a long time, given that the book discovered just happens to authorize exactly the reforms that Josiah was already inclined to make. High places were destroyed, Ashura worship was eliminated, despite the archaeology showing that it was widespread throughout pre-exilic Israel, and alternative priestly traditions were suppressed. The Divine Council material Heiser documented, the First Temple theology Barker documented, and the embodied relational God of the earlier tradition was all reshaped under the post-Reform theological framework. The Reformed tradition eventually became the Masoretic text, which is the basis for most modern Old Testaments. Now, here's the step-by-step for why this matters directly for the Book of Mormon. Lehi left Jerusalem around 600 BC, approximately 20 years after Josiah's reform, carrying the brass plates which represent his family's pre-reform scriptural tradition. So, step 1, the Book of Mormon reflects a pre-reform theological world, an embodied God and divine council elements, and a priestly structure that doesn't map neatly onto the post-reform Levitical hierarchy. Step 2, critics say that the Book of Mormon doesn't match the Bible, and they're right that it doesn't match the Josiah Reformed version of the Bible. And step 3, the Book of Mormon predates that reform by a generation. So, what critics are calling a mismatch is actually exactly what you'd expect from a genuine record that left Jerusalem before the reform fully consolidated. A fraudulent text written in 1830 would most likely mirror the Bible of 1830, the King James Version, and the post-reform tradition. But a genuine pre-reform record would look like what the Book of Mormon actually looks like. The mismatch that critics cite as evidence of fraud is, on closer inspection, actually evidence of authenticity. So, why don't more Christians engage with the scholarship if it's the academic consensus? Because following it through is too costly for most people. The documentary hypothesis means admitting that large portions of the Old Testament were composed or edited centuries after their attributed authors. Heiser's work means admitting ancient Israelite religion looked quite different from the strict monotheism Christianity inherited from its Greek philosophical period. Barker's work means admitting original doctrines were removed by institutional religious reform, which makes restoration a coherent historical category rather than a 19th century invention. Each of those conclusions moves the picture of the ancient world closer to what LDS theology describes. That's not a small thing for a tradition that's built on a particular reading of religious history. The academic world has largely moved. The popular evangelical world is still working with a framework that scholars have been revising for decades, which puts the community most likely to accuse LDS members of credulity in the position of being most resistant to following the actual scholarship. They'll argue that Joseph Smith was making things up, and when you point to what Heiser and Barker actually found, the response is usually to completely deny the sources, or at the very least, to question the LDS interpretation of the scholars, rather than engage the scholars themselves. That's a totally different thing. Disagreeing with our interpretation is legitimate. I'm here for it. But ignoring the scholarship entirely is a wild strategy. So, what has archaeology actually confirmed for the Book of Mormon? Critics describe it as a complete absence of evidence. Now, we covered the physical evidence pretty extensively in a previous episode, but here's the brief rundown. The zero evidence description gets less accurate every decade, but critics keep using it like nothing has changed since 1830. John Clark's 2005 retroactive assessment established that at publication, roughly 13% of the Book of Mormon's historical claims had any archaeological support. Matt Roper's research, published through the Neil A. Maxwell Institute at BYU, tracked the full list of claimed anachronisms through 2019. By 2005, 75% confirmed or supported. By 2019, 81% were confirmed or trending toward confirmation. Now, let me explain something so that nobody thinks I'm trying to pull one over. All of these figures are retroactive assessments, meaning that the scholars evaluated the state of evidence at each point in time using the same methodology. The comparison is consistent across all three data points, which is what makes the trajectory actually meaningful. We're not changing any of the rules partway through. So, some specifics worth knowing would be like Nahom, a place name in the Arabian Peninsula where the Book of Mormon says that Ishmael was buried and the family turned east. For 160 years, this was treated as a fictional place name. In the 1990s, non-LDS archaeologists working in Yemen confirmed the NHM inscriptions dated to the 6th century BC, the exact location and the exact time frame. Khor Karfot on the Omani coast matches all 12 textual criteria that the Book of Mormon specifies for the location called Bountiful. The Frankincense Trail, one of the most significant ancient Arabian trade routes, tracks closely with the journey described in the text. Cement construction in ancient Mesoamerica was called anachronistic until it was confirmed at Teotihuacan. Pre-Columbian barley was declared impossible until it was confirmed archaeologically. Case-hardened steel was thought to not exist in 600 BC until the ancient Near East confirmed its existence through multiple finds. And Chiasmus, an authentic ancient Hebrew literary structure, mirror image poetic composition used throughout the ancient Near East, is found extensively in the Book of Mormon. Unknown in Joseph Smith's time until John W. Welch first noticed it in the text in 1967, 138 years after publication. It appears in Alma chapter 36 with a complexity and internal consistency that indicates deliberate composition, and not just formally. Welch and subsequent scholars have analyzed the structure and found that the central hinge of the chiasm in Alma chapter 36 is the moment of Alma's conversion, which is also the theological center of the entire passage. That level of structural and thematic intentionality doesn't happen by accident in a text that long. Joseph Smith didn't even know it was there, but it was there regardless. So, what's honestly still unresolved, and how do critics keep saying zero evidence after all that evidence? Well, let's talk about what's unresolved. For most critics, the main one is horses. The fossil record shows that Native American horses went extinct roughly 10,000 years ago. And while there's preliminary evidence suggesting isolated populations may have survived longer into the relevant period, that isn't established. Some geographic identifications remain working hypotheses rather than confirmed findings. And where exactly in the Americas the events took place involves a real disagreement even among faithful LDS scholars. Those are all genuine open questions, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But those questions need to be understood in context. Right now, we're at 81% confirmation, with a small fraction of the relevant territory even being excavated. Based on the proportion of known sites to estimated total sites in the LiDAR surveys, researchers believe that we've accessed somewhere in the range of only 10% of what's actually there. And what little has been accessed has been excavated under some of the worst preservation conditions on Earth. Tropical heat, acidic jungle soil, and extreme humidity destroy organic materials in decades that would otherwise survive for millennia in the Sinai Desert, which is part of why the Dead Sea Scrolls exist and comparable Mesoamerican records largely don't. Beyond the preservation problem, NAGPRA and similar indigenous heritage laws throughout Central and South America restrict excavation in many of the most relevant territories for legitimate ethical reasons. But the consequence is that significant amounts of potentially relevant land simply haven't been dug. LiDAR surveys in the last decade alone have revealed that Mesoamerican civilization was far more extensive than the excavated record suggested. A 2018 survey in Guatemala identified tens of thousands of previously unknown structures. That's kind of a lot. The unresolved items are the gap between where the evidence currently is and where the trajectory is heading. As for how critics keep saying zero evidence, I really can't rationalize, but the pattern is straightforward. A claim gets established as proof of fraud and repeated for decades. New evidence then comes in, and the critic drops it without acknowledgement and moves on to the next one like it never happened. For example, Alma is a male Hebrew name. It was dismissed as invented for over a century, but then confirmed in the Bar Kokhba cave documents from the Dead Sea region, which include Alma son of Judah as an authentic ancient Hebrew male name. But there was no update and no acknowledgement. Same with Nahom, same with cement, and same with Chiasmus. If every specific item on your list keeps getting confirmed and you keep quietly removing it and moving on, at some point you gotta call it what it is. So, if the evidence is this consistent, why don't more people in general engage with it honestly? Mostly because the caricatures are simply too strong, but also because the conclusions have consequences. Now, we talked about those conclusions and those consequences earlier, so I'm not going to rehash everything specifically, but just know that they all carry weight for somebody who has built their lifelong religious identity inside a particular framework. So, the easier path is to just attack the institution, attack the prophet, and repeat criticisms that were answered decades ago, and then simply avoid engaging with the scholarship directly. The evidence isn't actually the obstacle, the conclusions are. And to be fair about it, that dynamic runs in both directions. LDS members aren't immune to motivated reasoning either. As a former atheist, I can see this among the members every week. People on every side of this conversation can find themselves defending a conclusion that they reached rather than following the evidence where it goes. The difference here is that the trajectory of the evidence itself keeps moving toward corroboration, not away from it. That's not something that you would say about a position that requires the same list of proofs of fraud to keep getting quietly revised and dismissed. For LDS members watching, this is why knowing the material matters. Critics are counting on you not knowing what Heiser found, or what Barker documented, or what the Roper data shows. But when you know those things, you're not scrambling to defend anymore. You're now the one presenting the evidence. So here's the one that critics think totally settles it. If Heiser and Barker see all these parallels, why aren't they converting? Because recognizing a historical parallel isn't the same as accepting a theological conclusion. A historian who establishes that early American law drew heavily from English common law hasn't thereby become British. Barker documented that the first temple looks like the LDS temple, and then she concluded that her tradition represents the fulfilled form of the ancient picture. That's a theological interpretation layered on top of a historical observation, which is totally normal and totally okay. And the historical observation stands regardless of which interpretation you accept. Barker believes Christ fulfilled and completed what the first temple pointed toward, and that her tradition is the mature form of the original. Heiser believes that the divine council story in the Hebrew Bible reaches its resolution in the New Testament's understanding of Christ. So, they both look at LDS theology, recognize it as genuinely ancient, and interpret that antiquity as evidence that it represents an earlier stage of a journey that continued further. They simply see the LDS position as stopping short. It's old, not new. The LDS response is that we don't believe the gospel is just a progression towards a new truth that gradually replaced the old ones. The original gospel is the fullness. What apostasy produced wasn't a more developed form of truth. It was an institutionalized, philosophically overlaid version that lost both the doctrines and the priesthood authority structure that the original contained. Barker and Heiser have recovered pieces of what the original looked like. What they found is consistent with what the restoration put back. They see us as ancient and consider it a limitation. We just consider it as the credential. Now, to close out this argument, we're going to take a step back, because this is where the evidence argument ends and the theological conclusions begin. The scholars can document what the ancient world looked like. They can confirm that the ancient Hebrew text has divine council theology. They can verify that the first temple preserved deification doctrine. And they can demonstrate that ancient Arabian geography matches the Book of Mormon's descriptions. But at the end of the day, none of that tells you whether Joseph Smith was a prophet. That's a conclusion that the evidence informs, but it doesn't answer on its own. What we're saying is that the evidence is consistent with the claim. And that's a very different position from the one that critics are making when they say that it's all invented. You can dispute the theological interpretation, but you cannot honestly say that there's nothing there. So here's where I want to land all this today. I'm not asking anyone to accept the LDS truth claims. You don't have to draw the same theological conclusions that we do. That's a totally personal decision involving a lot more than an argument about bara or chiasmus or First Temple theology. But there's a meaningful difference between disagreeing with our conclusions and misrepresenting what the evidence actually looks like. The caricature of Joseph Smith as a con man who invented a brand new religion out of thin air and then sold it to credulous 19th century farmers requires you to ignore what all of the scholarship has actually found. At some point, when maintaining that caricature requires denying that much corroborating evidence from that many independent and non-LDS sources, it's worth stepping back and asking whether the caricature is driving the evaluation rather than the other way around, because that's pretty much what it starts to look like. The LDS position isn't that the evidence proves church is true. The position is that the evidence is inconsistent with the version of the story that Joseph Smith invented something novel and fraudulent. The ancient world broadly understood matter as eternal. The original Hebrew text described an embodied God and a divine council of divine beings. The first temple preserved deification doctrine that was stripped out by institutional reform. Modern physics is consistent with organized eternal matter and not with absolute creation from nothing. The archaeological trendline for the Book of Mormon runs in one direction for nearly 200 years. You can disagree about what all that means theologically, but denying that it exists isn't a position. It's just not engaging with the material or reality. The people that like to call us the blind faith religion are the ones defending ex nihilo, a trinity formalized under an emperor who wasn't even baptized, and a textual tradition that scholars have documented was institutionally reshaped for centuries. If that's what rigorous faith looks like, I'll take the blind kind. And when those scholars see the parallels and don't convert, that's not a problem for our argument. They see what we look like and disagree about what that means. That's a legitimate theological conversation that we can have. But it's a very different conversation than there's no evidence. And finally, if you're here simply because you're curious about where we stand, we believe the original gospel has been on this earth since the beginning. We believe it was progressively lost as institutions replaced prophets and philosophy replaced scripture. We also believe it was restored through the prophet Joseph Smith, and the world modern scholarship keeps uncovering is consistent with that claim. All of my sources are in the pinned comment. Go see for yourself. I'm Alex Arnold, and this is Moroni Standard.